some of the properties of S3. So today and tomorrow we will be looking at totally 10 properties of S3, out of which today we will look at 5, and then tomorrow we will look at the next 5, and we will also do the practicality of it. Okay. So some of the properties of S3 are, the first property is called as versioning, the second is server access logging, the third one is static website hosting, fourth one is object level logging, then you have encryption that S3 supports, and then you have object lock. So one note about object lock is that it can be enabled only when you create the bucket, not after you have created the bucket. So just one thing to note about object lock is that you can only enable it only when you create the bucket, not after you have created the bucket. Okay. And we can also associate tags with our S3 bucket, so as to do some cost-based analysis and so on. And transfer acceleration utilizes edge locations, which is part of AWS global infrastructure, to access your objects in your S3 bucket at a much faster rate with very less latency. And then you also have events, wherein for every API call that happens to your S3 bucket, whether it can be a create object or a put object, or it can be a delete object or an update object, some of these APIs you will be able to go ahead and trigger a notification, or you'll be able to publish a message to an SQS queue, or you will be able to trigger a Lambda function. So those come under events, which we will look tomorrow at in more detail. And then the last one is requester pace. So these are some of the properties of an S3 bucket. So today we'll be concentrating on versioning, server access logging, static website hosting, object level logging, default encryption. The first 5 properties. Okay. So to start off with versioning. So versioning enables you to keep multiple versions of an object in one S3 bucket. When versioning is enabled, a version ID is associated with every version of the object that you store. So let's say for the first time you upload an object, that object has version 1 associated with it, and version ID is auto-generated and associated with the same object. So let's say 1 day or 2 days down the line, you go ahead and update the object, and then you go ahead and upload the same object to the S3 bucket, maintaining the same file name, or that means maintaining the same key name. Automatically a second version of the object is created, and then version ID is associated with it. So when you enable versioning on the bucket, it cannot be turned off. It can only be suspended. So that means what happens is, if I enable versioning, you will have multiple versions of an object in an S3 bucket. But when you suspend versioning for a brief period of time that you want to do that for, you will not have multiple versions of that object that you upload in the time that the versioning is suspended. Okay. And then versioning is one way to safeguard your objects in the S3 bucket. So if suppose people go ahead and try to update an object, or they try to delete an object, you will still have previous versions of that object existing in the S3 bucket. And another way to safeguard your objects in the S3 bucket is to use MFA delete. So you can associate MFA with your objects in the S3 bucket. So if suppose anyone would like to delete an object, they will have to present a 6-digit code in order to go ahead and delete the object, which is another way to safeguard your objects. And then to enable versioning on the bucket, all that we have to do is go to properties, click on versioning, and then click on enable versioning. So in order to even suspend versioning on the bucket, we have to go to properties, click on versioning, and then click on suspend versioning. Okay. So versioning is nothing but, in one line, it's nothing but it enables you to keep multiple versions of an object in one S3 bucket. Okay. So moving on to the second property. Second property is called as server access logging. So in the previous lecture, when we went ahead and created an S3 bucket, we saw that we were able to also provide in the bucket ACL access to a log delivery group to provide logs or to write logs to an S3 bucket. Okay. So to enable server access logging, we will have to provide that log delivery group of S3 to write all the logs to an S3 bucket. So what actually server access logging does? Okay. So it provides detailed records for some of the requests that are made to an S3 bucket. So server access logs are very useful for many applications. For example, who is accessing that particular bucket can be used in terms of security and access audits. It can also help you learn about your customer base and help you understand your S3 bill. Okay. To track requests for access to your bucket, you can enable server access logging. So each access log provides details about a single access request, such as who's the requester, what is the bucket name, when was the request done, that means at what time, and then what was the request action, whether it was a get request or whether it was a put request or whether it was a delete request, and then what is the response status, whether it was a 200 successful response or was it a 201 successful created response, or whether it was an error code, whether it could be a probably a 400 or a 500 response. Okay, so these are some of the details that you will be able to find in a log file that is being presented to you by the S3 log delivery group. So to turn on log delivery by adding logging configuration on the bucket, so that means we have to go to an S3 bucket, click on properties, click on server access logging, and then present an S3 bucket where you'll be storing all the logs. So for that particular bucket that you create where you'll be storing all the logs, we need to grant the S3 log delivery group write permissions on the bucket where you want the access logs to be saved. We refer to this bucket as the target bucket. So that means, let's say, for example, that we have 10 S3 buckets on which we want to enable server access logging. All these 10 S3 buckets server access logs can be redirected to one S3 bucket, okay, where the log delivery group has write permissions. So you can imagine it as 10 S3 buckets where you want to enable server access logging. You have to enable it on all the 10 buckets, and then all the logs of these 10 buckets in terms of who requested the access to that particular bucket, what was the bucket name, what was the request time, and all those related details will be stored in one S3 log bucket. Okay, so that one bucket will generally be used for auditing purposes, and for that one bucket we will have to provide the S3 log delivery group write permission. Okay, and then when it comes to the third property called as static website hosting, at the start we mentioned that we will have to go ahead and create a bucket, but the bucket name should be a DNS compliant name, and it should be unique, and it should be globally available, right? So that means anyone who is using an S3 bucket with the same name in another AWS account, you will not be able to use the same name for your S3 bucket. So using that same concept of DNS compliant names, they have brought about the feature called as static website hosting, where you can host a website on S3. So this can only be a static website, so it can only consist of assets in terms of HTML code, CSS code, JavaScript code. It can also be any images for that website. It can also be any other static content like PDF related files for that particular website. So you can see that they might also contain certain client-side scripts, which means JavaScript is also supported. Even TypeScript is supported. If you want to deploy an Angular application to a S3 bucket, that's very much possible. But then, in contrast, a dynamic website relies on server-side processing. So we will not be able to run PHP or JSP or ASP.NET related scripts from an S3 bucket, because AWS S3 does not support server-side scripting. It only supports static website hosting in terms of HTML, CSS, and JS content. That is the easiest way to deploy a website. So to host a static website using S3, one has to enable the setting on the properties section of the S3 bucket, and then we have to upload an index.html and place it in the root of the S3 bucket. Okay, and then we have to enable public read for all objects using a bucket policy on the S3 bucket. So ultimately, your website should be available globally, right, for all the users. Okay, so when it's available globally, that means they should have a read access to all of your objects of your particular website. Okay, so that means we will have to enable public read only for all the objects and not write. So public read only for all the objects. We'll be doing that using a bucket policy on the S3 bucket, or you can go ahead and click on that individual index.html file that you have placed, and then click on actions and click on make public. So either way, you can either place a bucket policy that enables public read for all objects, or for every object in your S3 bucket that you store it in the root of the S3 bucket, go ahead and make it public using an ACL also. Either way is possible. Okay? And then you can view the website from the auto-generated endpoint that is provided by AWS. Okay, so AWS, for every bucket, since it has a DNS compliant name and it's unique, AWS themselves provide an endpoint that is auto-generated based on your bucket name and your region name. Okay, region code. And one can optionally configure an error.html file in case if there are any 400 or 500 errors on the website. Your error.html will kick into place, and you will be viewing the content in your error.html if suppose there are any errors. Okay, so this is regarding static website hosting. So this is the third S3 property that we have studied. So when it comes to object level logging, so there are some events called as data events. Okay, so this is the fourth property of the S3 bucket. So data events provide insights into the resource operations that are performed on or within a resource. So these are also known as data plane operations. So for example, you can see that for an S3 object level API activity, okay, for example, whether a user wants to get a particular object, or whether the user wants to delete a particular object, or whether the user wants to create a particular object using the put object API. So these are all API actions. And similarly, for another example using AWS Lambda, invoking the Lambda function could be an API action, or executing the Lambda function could be an API action. Okay, so these data events are can be logged using S3, okay, using the property called as object level logging. So these data events, to enable logging for all these data events like get object or delete object or put object, we will have to use another service in combination with S3 to enable this. So the other service that we are going to use over here, that is a management service of AWS, is called as CloudTrail. Okay, so there is a difference between CloudTrail and CloudWatch. CloudWatch is used to monitor all your resources in your AWS account, which is another management service. But then when it comes to CloudTrail, CloudTrail is used to monitor all your API activities in your AWS account. Okay, so to enable object level logging, what we will generally do is okay, to talk more about API activity, every action or every click that you do on the console is an API activity. In fact, each and every API call that you do with the AWS CLI, right? AWS S3 LS or AWS S3 MB to create a new bucket, or AWS S3 LS and specific bucket name to list all the objects within that bucket. These are also API activities. So all of these API activities, whatever you do on the console or whatever you do on the CLI, all of these API activities are being logged through a service called as CloudTrail. Okay, so first we will have to enable CloudTrail. So we have to create a CloudTrail trail in the CloudTrail's console, and then we can do one thing. We can choose this trail to be applicable across all regions or only specific regions. So for best practice, we will do it across all regions, and then we will have to choose all S3 buckets or individual S3 buckets. Okay, and then we can choose all actions. And before creating the trail, you can also log the activities of these data events that are generated by CloudTrail to another S3 bucket, because ultimately these are all logs. You don't want these logs to reside in any one of your application's S3 buckets. You would generally like it to be a separate S3 bucket. Similarly as to how you did it for server access logging. So for server access logging, we described that when we have 10 S3 buckets, and all the logs that are generated by these 10 S3 buckets are logged into one S3 bucket where the S3 log delivery group has permissions, right? So similarly over here, for all the S3 buckets in your AWS account, for all the API activity related logging, we will be able to push out all the logs of those API activity to one S3 bucket for auditing purposes, or we can also put it to one CloudWatch log group. So that is also another configuration that we can do. And then finally, we can create the trail. So thereby by default, when it's enabled for all S3 buckets, any new buckets also that you create in the future will also be enabled with this setting on the properties side. Okay, so object level logging is mainly used to track and monitor all your API activities for the objects that you have in your S3 bucket. Okay, and when it comes to server access logging, it's nothing but it gives you information about who accessed that particular bucket. Okay, and what was the bucket name, what was the request time when it was done, and what was the request action, and what is the response code. But then over here, you will also be able to find granular level details in terms of what is that person's IP address, what is the resource that he was trying to access. Okay, so literally any API activity in your entire AWS account can be monitored using CloudTrail. So let's think about one particular scenario. Okay, so in this scenario, what happens is, if suppose you are working in an organization, you are working in the development team, and you have created an S3 bucket for yourself, and you have uploaded 5 objects to the S3 bucket, and then you have gone for the day, you have completed your work for the day, you have gone back home, and the next day that you are coming into the organization, you find out that 3 objects are only residing in your S3 bucket, 2 objects have been deleted. So how will you find out as to who is the person who went ahead and deleted this particular object? that you had in your S3 bucket, who deleted those two objects. You will not be able to find that using server access logs. You will only be able to find that using object level logging, because you have enabled CloudTrail for API actions. So you can go ahead and look at your CloudTrail logs and find out the particular person's IP address as to who went ahead and deleted that particular object in your S3 bucket. So using that IP address, you can find out whether it's an internal person in your organization, because ultimately your organization has its own range of IP address, or whether it's a person who is an external to the organization. Ultimately, if it's a person who is internal to the organization, you can check in with your own team and find out as to who that person is. Or if it's a person who is external to the organization, you can go ahead and see whether you have given any access to anyone who is outside of your organization. Just look at some of the access policies that you have given for a person who is residing outside of your organization. Or you may even be able to find out using the IP address whether it is an internal IP address of your organization, or whether it's a public IP that a person used when he was accessing S3 from his house. So these many related analysis you will be able to do using a CloudTrail log. So we will be looking at one CloudTrail log syntax, and then you will be able to find out how much detail it provides in terms of an API activity. Okay. And finally, the fifth property that we are going to study today is called as encryption. Okay. So this is on a high level overview that I'll be giving encryption to you, because it's a very basic setting that is enabled. And Amazon S3 default encryption provides a way to encrypt all of your objects in an S3 bucket. Okay, so you can set the default encryption on the bucket level, so that all the objects and any new objects are also encrypted when they are stored in the S3 bucket. So generally, the good practice would be to go ahead and enable encryption at the start itself when you create the bucket, rather than enabling it at a later point of time when you already have objects in your S3 bucket. Because if you enable encryption at a later point of time, from then on only encryption is enabled. For all the previous objects that were there in your S3 bucket, they are not encrypted still. Okay, so the best practice would be to go ahead and enable encryption right when you create the S3 bucket. So the objects in the S3 bucket are encrypted using server-side encryption, either using S3 managed keys. So it's called as server-side encryption by S3, or customer master keys stored in the key management service, or AWS KMS. Okay, we will not deep dive into what AWS KMS is, but then understand that there are two ways that you can enable encryption on your S3 bucket. One is through server-side encryption S3, and the other one is through KMS. So when you enable server-side encryption, Amazon S3 themselves internally encrypt the object before saving it to the disk, and also decrypts it when you try to download the object. So by default, the owner will have all access, right, to an S3 bucket. The person who created the S3 bucket will have all access, is what we saw last week. So when the user goes ahead and uploads an object with encryption enabled, S3 internally encrypts the object before storing it to disk, and then decrypts it when you go ahead and download the object. And there is no change to the encryption of objects that existed in the bucket before default encryption was enabled. So that means, like I mentioned, if you create an S3 bucket and you upload 10 objects to it, and then you go ahead and enable encryption, those particular 10 objects are not going to be encrypted. Any objects that you store after enabling encryption are only going to be encrypted. So when you upload objects after enabling default encryption, if your put request while you create the object does not include any encryption information, S3 uses the bucket's default encryption settings to encrypt your objects. But if your put request includes any kind of encryption information, S3 uses the encryption information from your put request to encrypt the object before storing them in S3. Okay, so this is a really high level overview as to how encryption works in S3. So that means there are two settings that we can look at. One is encryption using server-side encryption with S3, where S3 manages the keys and all that. And the other one is using AWS KMS to encrypt your objects using S3. Okay, so these are some of the properties. So this is the end of the slide. So just to go back and look at each of the properties in a high level overview, versioning allows you to go ahead and enable multiple versions of your objects in an S3 bucket. So you can only enable versioning, and you can only suspend versioning. You cannot just totally disable versioning forever. Okay. And then when it comes to server access loggings, we can look at this with a scenario that when we have 10 S3 buckets and we would like to log all the activities of these S3 buckets as to who's accessing, what was the time that they access these S3 buckets, what was the response code that they got. So these kinds of information can be logged into one particular log bucket, and that one particular log bucket should have access given from the log delivery group with right permission on that particular bucket. And when it comes to static website hosting, it's nothing but you will be able to go ahead and serve your web content from an S3 bucket. So it can be static files in terms of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, any images that you may have, or it can be any PDF files that you may have. But these are all static content. Okay, so S3 does not support server-side scripting such as using a programming language like PHP or JSP or ASP.NET. So to enable static website hosting, you have to provide index.html file. And then the prerequisite is to always ensure that you have public read for all of your objects within the S3 bucket. Okay. And you can also provide an optional error.html file in case there are any 400 or 500 errors on the website. And then when it comes to object level logging, these are logging your data events or your data plane events in terms of the API activities. Okay, so whether a person gets an object or puts an object or deletes an object or updates an object. So these kinds of API activity event, we will be able to log using another service called as CloudTrail. So in CloudTrail, we will have to create a trail. And once we have created a trail, you can choose to have it across all regions or across one particular region. And then you can also choose to have all S3 buckets being monitored through CloudTrail, or just only one or two S3 buckets depending on your use case. And then finally, you can go ahead and create the trail. And before creating the trail, you can also ensure that these logs are written to one particular S3 bucket, as in the same case as that of server access logging, or you can log it to a CloudWatch log group. Okay. And then by default, when enabled for all the S3 buckets, which is a good practice, any new S3 buckets also that you create will be monitored by CloudTrail automatically. You don't need to do a configuration separately again for the new bucket that you create. And then when it comes to default encryption, there are two types of encryptions which you can use. One is through server-side S3 encryption, and the other one is using a service called as Key Management Service or AWS KMS. So when you use server-side encryption, Amazon internally does the encryption before saving the object to the disk, and then when you download the object, it internally does the decryption also, so that you are able to see the actual contents of that particular object. And there is no change to the encryption of the objects that existed in the bucket before default encryption was enabled. So like I mentioned before, if you have an S3 bucket and you have uploaded 10 objects to it, and then you enable default encryption, your previous 10 objects are not encrypted. Only the objects that you upload after enabling default encryption is encrypted. And then if suppose you're uploading objects to an S3 bucket with enabling default encryption, if your put request headers does not contain any kind of encryption information, Amazon S3 uses the bucket's default encryption settings itself that you have enabled on the bucket. Or if you present any kind of encryption information, then S3 uses that encryption information that you present through the put request headers. Okay. So now let's go back to the AWS console. Okay. So right now I have logged into the console and I have logged in as the root account user. So we are going to open S3 in a new tab and we are going to walk through all of the properties. Okay. So you can see over here that there are other buckets that I have in my S3 account, but then we are going to go ahead and create a bucket that is going to be only used for logs. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and create a bucket. So we will do server access logging first because we will create a bucket called as log bucket first. Okay. So we are going to give the bucket name as Akshay2395, okay, with server access logs. And we are going to place this bucket in the same region that we are going to enable server access logs for another bucket that is in the same region. Ultimately, the only condition is that these buckets have to be in the same region. Okay. So your log bucket should be in the same region, and all the other buckets that you want to send the logs to this particular bucket should also be in the same region. Okay. So I'm going to place it in the Northern Virginia region. I'm going to click on next. I'm not going to configure any options over here. I'm going to click on next. Under set permissions, I'm going to disable this setting. Okay. And then when I scroll down, it has presented over here a setting that we can enable for the S3 log delivery group to write access to this bucket, write all the logs. So I'm going to grant the S3 log delivery group write access to this bucket. So this is going to be my log bucket where all my server access logs are going to be sent out to. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to click on create bucket. Okay. So this is going to be our server access logs bucket. Okay. So the next bucket that we are going to go ahead and create, this bucket is going to be for static website hosting. Okay. So we are going to click on create bucket. And then for static website hosting, I'm going to do it as Akshay 2395 static website. Okay. I'm going to place it in the same Northern Virginia region. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to remove this setting. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to click on create bucket. Okay. So within the static website bucket, okay, within the static website bucket, I'm going to go ahead and first enable server access logs. Okay. So I'm going to go to properties. I'm going to go to server access logging. I'm going to click on enable logging. I'm going to choose the target bucket to be my server access logs bucket. And then I can present a target prefix. I'm going to say static website is my target prefix. So all the logs, all the server access logs from this particular bucket will be sent out to the server access logs bucket with the prefix of static website. So that means all the logs will be residing within a folder called as static website. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click on save. So server access logging is enabled. So with the same S3 bucket itself, where we have created it as a static website bucket, we are going to also enable static website hosting. Okay. So to enable static website hosting, we are going to click on static website hosting, and automatically you can see, since we presented a DNS compliant name that is unique and globally available, S3 has internally, or let's say Amazon has internally generated an endpoint for us to access our website. So this endpoint is in the format of bucket name dot s3 hyphen website hyphen region code dot amazonaws.com. This is very important to note. Okay, how the endpoint is formed. So we are going to use this bucket to host the website. I haven't written any index.html still, but then I'm going to present that my index document is index.html, my error document is error.html. And if there are any redirectional rules, if you want to present any redirectional rules, you can present those over here. Any redirection requests, you can present those over here. Okay, whether you want this, whether you want to go ahead and serve the content from this particular S3 bucket to another target domain or any other target bucket, and using which protocol you want to do that, whether it's HTTP or HTTPS. We are not going to do any redirect requests, okay, from this S3 bucket. We are going to use this bucket in itself to go ahead and host a static website. If there are any doubts, you can just go ahead and click on this learn more and understand as to how redirect request works. But right now we are going to use this bucket itself to host a static website, and also you can disable website hosting at a later point of time. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on save. I don't have any index.html or error.html. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to overview, and then I'm going to upload an index and error.html file. Okay, so let me first go ahead and create those files. So I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, which enables me to do that. So I'm going to click on file, new file. I'm just going to say hello cloud gurus. I'm going to click on save. I'm going to save it under documents folder. I'm going to give the name as index.html. Click on save. And then similarly, I'm going to create one more file called as error.html. I'm going to say error. Control S, save it under documents, call it as error.html. Click on save. So going back to the bucket, you can just click on upload, click on add files, click on documents, and then click on your index and error.html, and then click on open, and then click on upload. So one thing to notice, this index and error.html should be on the root of the S3 bucket. So it shouldn't be within any particular prefix or within any particular folder. Okay, it should be within the root of the S3 bucket. So right when you click on the bucket itself, you should view these contents. Not when you click on a bucket and then click on a folder. That should not be the way how it works. Okay, it should be on the root of the S3 bucket. So right now when we go ahead and click on properties and then click on static website hosting and copy this endpoint and paste it in a new tab, you are getting a 403 forbidden. It says access denied. The only reason is because the prerequisite for S3 static website hosting to work is that you have to make your objects within the bucket as public, okay, or using read access or global read access. So that can be done by going ahead and clicking on permissions and using a bucket policy, or Since we have just only 2 files right now, I'm just going to click on both the files, click on actions, click on make public, and then click on make public. So both these objects right now will have public read access. So let's go ahead and Control Shift R to reload this. You can see we get the website content, which is Hello Cloud Gurus. Okay. So this is the random generated endpoint of your static website. So if suppose, let's say for a scenario that I have my entire Angular application over here, all the files of your Angular application should have public read access. So that can be easily done using a bucket policy. If you don't want to do it for individual files one by one and doing that make public, you can just paste a bucket policy that has public read access. So one activity that I would give you today is to go ahead and look at a bucket policy that would enable you to give public read access alone, okay, for this particular bucket. So we have seen two configurations right now. One configuration is for server access logging, okay, where you enabled all your access logs to go to a separate S3 bucket where the log delivery group had write access to that logging bucket. And the second property that we have seen is static website hosting. We will also look at versioning and object level logging using another S3 bucket, okay. So I'm going to go back to S3. I'm going to create a bucket. I'm going to call this bucket as Akshay2395 versioning. I'm going to place it in the Northern Virginia region. I'm going to click on next, click on next, click on, disable this setting, which is block all public access. We have seen what the setting is before in the previous lecture, and then click on create the bucket. Okay. So I'm going to go into this bucket, Akshay2395 versioning, click on properties, click on versioning, enable versioning. So you can see over here, there are two configurations like we mentioned, enable versioning and suspend versioning. So suspend versioning, it suspends the creation of object versions for all operations, but preserves any existing object versions. Okay. So that's why they said you cannot disable versioning all the, totally, you can only suspend it. Okay. And generally people will never suspend versioning. Once they have enabled it, people will never suspend versioning. So we will enable versioning and click on save. So right now, if we go ahead and upload an object, so let's say we upload the same index.html. And one more thing to note on the UI side of things is you will get an option over here to show and hide versions. Okay. So right now we don't have any versions, or we don't have any objects in fact. So we will not be able to see that. But then this particular UI extra thing is hidden. It will only be enabled when you enable version. Okay. On all the other buckets, you will not see this setting until and unless you enable version. So we'll click on upload. We'll click on add files. We will upload the same index.html file. Click on open. Click on upload. So right now you can see we are under hide versions. So you can see there is an index.html file. So last modified date is this. Size is 17 bytes. Storage class is standard by default. When you click on show versions, you can see a version ID is associated, which is the random characters that AWS has generated. It's a unique one. So this version ID is associated with the latest version of the object because we have ultimately only one version right now. So we'll click on hide. We will go ahead and modify this index.html since we have it open over here. Okay, once we have modified this file, let's go ahead and upload the file with the same key name, which is the same index.html name. Right now it will be of a higher size in terms of bytes. Previously it was 17, now it's 37 bytes. When you click on upload, under hide versions, you will only see only one version over here. You may think that it has overridden the previous version. It has not, in fact, because we have enabled versioning. When you click on show versions, you will be able to see there are two versions of your files right now. So you have the latest version as well as the first version that you have created, which was 17 bytes, which has only the content, Hello Cloud Gurus. The second file has the content, Hello Cloud Gurus and how are you doing? Okay. So if suppose we want to go ahead and delete the object, okay, with hide versions, if we go ahead and delete the object, click on the object, click on actions, click on delete, click on delete. The object will be removed from the S3 bucket. Okay. But then when you click on show versions over here, you can see that the object is actually not deleted. You have a delete marker that is placed on that object. Okay. So that means you still have both your previous versions. So this is the advantage of using versioning. That's why I said you can safeguard your objects. Even when you hide versions, it may not show over here. But then when you click on show versions, you actually still have both the previous versions of your objects over here. So that now you can go ahead and just click on this object, click on download and upload it back to the S3 bucket. Or you want to upload this particular version, you can do that. Or you want to go ahead and probably now If you want to go ahead and just delete all of these versions, you can just click on all of these versions over here, click on actions and click on delete. So that's why I mentioned versioning is one way to safeguard your objects, because when you go ahead and delete the object, you may not see it over here in this UI over here, but ultimately it does not actually delete that object. This was the latest version. It does not actually delete the latest version. It only places a delete marker on that particular object. Okay. So what we can do right now is go ahead and click on this object and click on download. This was our latest version. Click on download. You'll be able to download the index.html file. Then go ahead and hide versions. Okay. Click on upload, click on add files and upload that index.html back. So under downloads, we have that index.html file. Yeah. Click on open, click on upload. Okay. So you can see we got back our latest version that we had. So now under show versioning, you can see that even though the delete marker was placed, we got the next version of the object, which is the latest version that was the same as this one. So internally, you may think that S3 has deleted the object, but with versioning enabled, all it does is place a delete marker. So now what happens if you go ahead and delete the object with versioning as show? We did it with versioning as hide. We went ahead and deleted the object. With versioning as show, what happens if you delete the object? So let's click on this latest version. Let's click on actions. Let's click on delete. Let's click on delete. It has deleted that latest version. Even all these previous versions, I'm just clicking on it and clicking on delete. I'm deleting all the versions of my object. Okay. So now under show versionings, you will have 0 objects. Under hide versionings, you will have 0 objects, because AWS internally thinks to themselves that when a person deletes an object with hide versioning enabled, that means that it places a delete marker on that object. They have done it by mistake. But then when you do it with show versions as enabled, you are actually deleting the object. You are actually deleting the versions of the object. That is the difference when you do it with hide and show versioning. With hide versioning, it ultimately places a delete marker. But with show versioning, you delete the object. AWS thinks to themselves, okay, these guys have enabled show versioning and they actually know what they are doing. Let's go ahead and delete the object. Okay, that's how they think, or that's how probably I think and I correlate with it. So when you have hide versionings, it means that you actually don't know what you're doing. You are doubtful. You have deleted the object. You have made a mistake. Okay, now AWS thinks, okay, let me just go ahead and place a delete marker. But then when you have show versioning enabled and you go ahead and delete an object, I mean, AWS thinks that you actually know what you're doing. Okay, so this all it is related to versioning. Okay, and then if suppose I want to go ahead and suspend versioning, okay, I'll be able to go back to properties, click on versioning, click on suspend versioning, click on save. Versioning is suspended, but I don't want to do that. I'm just going to keep versioning enabled. Okay. So while like how we read it in the theory, when you have versioning suspended, it means that no version ID is stored for that object. There is only one version of that being stored of that object. And if you go ahead and keep uploading multiple versions of that same object, your previous versions will be overridden if it's in suspend versioning. If it's in enabled state, automatically you will have version IDs associated with each versions of your object. Okay. So there is only one more property that we have to look at. I mean, probably two more properties that we have to look at. One is object level logging and the other one is default encryption. So we will first look at object level logging. Okay. So to do object level logging, what we have to do is we have to go to a service called as CloudTrail. So I'm going to open it in a new tab. So we are in the region US East 1 right now. Okay. And we can go ahead and create a trail. We can give the trail a name. So I'm going to give it as S3 trail. I'm going to apply it for all regions for good, good practice. And I'm going to log all management events, which are read-write events. But you can, in fact, go ahead and do only read events or write events or log none of the events, which generally you wouldn't do. So you can go, for good practice, log all the events that are happening. So for the data events alone, you have two, like we mentioned in the slides, you have one for S3 and one for Lambda. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose all the S3 buckets in my account. If not, I can add a specific bucket if I want to. But then for good practice alone, I'm going to log all API related activities for all the S3 buckets. Similarly for Lambda, I don't have any Lambda functions. Probably one or two would be there, but then I'm going to log all current and future functions. Okay. So the storage location. Okay. So like how we mentioned for server access logs, we created a new S3 bucket where we gave the S3 log delivery group write permissions for that S3 bucket. Similarly, for CloudTrail related for CloudTrail related API logs, we are going to create a new S3 bucket. We are going to call it as Akshay 2395 hyphen API logs. Okay. And under the advanced, you can present a log file prefix. Okay. If you want to, otherwise automatically the prefix will be mentioned like this. So the prefix is going to be AWS logs, your account ID, your CloudTrail, and the respective region. Okay. So we are going to present no log file prefix. Let it be the same. Okay. And then you can see over here that you can encrypt all your log files itself with server-side encryption. So not necessarily just your S3 default encryption setting where you encrypt all of your objects with server-side KMS. You can in fact go ahead and encrypt all of your log files that are present within this S3 bucket, which are going to be put into this S3 bucket using server-side encryption with KMS. And then enable log file validation. We are going to look at this when we look at CloudTrail, not right now. And you can also send notification for each and every log file that is delivered to your S3 bucket. So that is also possible. You can send a notification. You can get a notification in your mail for each and every log file that is delivered. I'm not going to enable this because then my mail will be flooded, okay, with a lot of AWS related messages. Because for each and every API activity, I'll be getting a mail, which I don't want. Okay, so I'm just going to keep this as no, and then I'm going to click on create. So once you click on create, your S3 trail is enabled. Okay. So when your S3 trail is enabled, what happens is in your S3 management console, you can take any of your buckets present over here. You can take any of your buckets. Just for example, we will take our versioning bucket. Under properties, you can see that object level logging is enabled by default. We didn't enable it from here. We enabled it from CloudTrail across all the S3 buckets. So that's why across all S3 buckets, object level logging is enabled. So once object level logging is enabled, let's find out as to what happens if we go ahead and do any API actions. So let's say we go ahead and upload a new file. Okay. I'm going to click on upload, click on add files, and then going to click on uploading the index.html file again. Okay. Click on open, click on upload. So this is a put object API activity. Okay. This is a put object API activity. So under CloudTrail, you can view event history over here. And you can see over here, your logs will be generated. Probably just give it a little bit more time. You will see all of your events over here. So what we are looking for is a put object API activity. So 3:31:54 was the last log. What is the time right now? 3:45. So we will have to wait probably for a little bit of time. So you can see over here, you can, go ahead and filter. Okay. So the event name, I'm going to filter it as put object. Is there any event name with put object? Okay, not necessarily event name. Let's go with the resource type. Okay, let's look at S3 bucket level resource type. Okay, so still we have only 331 timestamp related logs. We will probably wait for a little bit of time and we will be able to find out the latest event histories, event log that has been done, which is our put object. Or even let's in case just go ahead and look at our log bucket that was created, right? Because we created the log bucket, which was a new bucket that was created through CloudTrail. So let's just scroll down. Let's see if that log bucket is present. Let's refresh. We have 13 buckets. The API logs is the bucket that was created for all our API logs. Click on this bucket, you have AWS logs. You don't have probably, okay, it's refreshing right now. So you have the account ID. You have CloudTrail. You have US East 1. You have 2019. You have the month 10, which is October. You have 19, which is today. And you can see that there are some logs files that have been generated with 345 timestamp. So that means we can go back to CloudTrail and just refresh this. It's still under 3. Okay, on the bucket level, it's okay. Let's look at something else so that, or probably what we will do is we'll just download these files. Okay, just click on all of these files, or probably the one that was generated recently. 345 timestamp, we have 3 files. Okay, let's get this particular file. Click on download. Let's open this file. So you can see so much amount of data has been generated, right? So we will not be able to go ahead and look at all of this data until we have pasted it in a particular JSON validator. So this is the amount of detail that you will get. Okay, but then you can see one specific field over here which is called as source IP. So this source IP is 49.207.135.250. You can match it with my public IP 49.207.135.250, 49.207.135.250. Okay, so this much amount of detail your CloudTrail logs have within them. You can even get the person's access key ID, find out who that IAM user is. So you can see over here access key ID. Okay, probably I shouldn't show it like this, but then let's see. Okay, probably let's okay, do read only events, or okay, let's click on event history one more time, then just refresh this page and look at whether any latest logs have been mentioned over here. Okay, so on the bucket, okay, let's filter by some other stuff also if possible. So resource name, event source, probably S3. Yeah, let's just wait for a second. Okay, so this UI shows only till 338 timestamp, which is the latest, but then we got our log files for 345 timestamp also. So you can just refresh over here and see that we got our logs files for 345 timestamp. Okay, probably just look at some of these logs. I mean, one thing that I would do is generally go ahead and do an SNS notification. So if I do a notification and I get the mail, I'll get a much better formatted, log file in my mail. But then probably you can do that as an activity. But then just understand that when you have a lot of these logs over here, you can just go ahead and find out the person's IP address. Okay, something that we saw over here, and which region he was working out of, what was the activity that he did, which was list buckets, what was the event source, s3.amazonaws.com, and what was his access key ID, like something over here, what was his access key ID, and so on. So these are the data that a CloudTrail API log provides. Okay, so similarly, let's just look at whether our server access logs were also generated and presented to us by our log delivery group. So that will probably take more than 15 to 20 minutes for it to be generated. So once it's generated, probably I'll show you as to how it works. But then you should be able to find some log files over here 15 to 20 minutes after you have enabled server access logs. So the last setting that we have to finally look at is only we have to look at default encryption. So when we spoke about encryption, we spoke about two types of encryption, which was server-side encryption using S3, and the other one was using KMS. Okay, so you can just go ahead and click on one of these checkboxes, radio buttons, to go ahead and enable which kind of encryption you would like. So probably what I would do is I would generally go with S3's encryption, server-side encryption using S3. But if suppose I had my key, that is my own customer managed key that I had, I'll be able to go ahead and use KMS encryption, which is key management service, and I'll be able to present my key. Okay, so you can see that there are two types of keys over here. One is a custom KMS ARN key, which is your customer managed keys. That's what we saw on the slide. So if I go back to the slide, you can see over here, you can use customer master keys or CMKs. Okay, sorry, customer master keys or CMK, or you can go ahead and use the default AWS S3 KMS key that is present in your AWS account. This is by default present in your AWS account. This is a key that you provide, or a customer master key that you provide. Okay, by default we will go with S3 AES 256 encryption using server-side encryption of S3, where AWS will internally encrypt your object before storing it to disk and decrypt your object when you go ahead and download the object. Okay, so just go ahead and click on save. That is how you enable encryption. Okay, so all of your objects right now, this particular object alone is not encrypted, these two objects, but then any other object that you go ahead and upload after you have enabled default encryption is encrypted. Okay, so these are all the properties of the S3 bucket that I wanted to show today. Probably I will send you a screenshot of the server access logs once it's available. It takes generally 15 to 20 minutes, but then that's how you enable server access logs, by going ahead and creating a new S3 bucket where the log delivery group has access to write all your server access logs, and then go to a specific S3 bucket like the one that we did for static website. Go to properties, enable server access logging by presenting your access log bucket and a prefix. Okay, so this is how you do server access logs. And you enable and disable, you enable and suspend versioning, not disable, sorry. And then when it comes to static website hosting, you present your index.html, error.html, and you're able to view your website. And then under object level logging, we did this to CloudTrail. We enabled CloudTrail across all regions, across all S3 buckets. And then when it comes to default encryption, we saw two settings. One is AES 256, internally done by S3, and the other one is using KMS, where you will be able to present the AWS S3 KMS key, or you will also be able to present a customer master key that you have created using the KMS service. Okay, so tomorrow we will look at object log, tags, transfer acceleration, event notification, and requester pace. Okay, we have a very nice tutorial for event notification. So we will look at these 5 settings, which are advanced settings on the S3 bucket tomorrow. Okay, and then the next week on Saturday, we will look at lifecycle replication and lifecycle configuration and replication, or cross-region replication. Okay, these are 2 settings that we will look at next Saturday. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop my recording right now and open up for questions. Okay. Just a second.